But it's my real pleasure just to welcome Jack Wakefield. Jack works for Tearfund. Tearfund is like, in some ways, like the premier kind of evangelical Christian charity, isn't it? We're going to give anywhere money, time, energy. Tearfund. How many people have ever been on a short-term Tearfund mission trip? Anyone? So some people in the room have done that. Certainly, we've partnered with Tearfund in terms of projects and through Love Running and some of the kind of the church partnership schemes that they've had, and they've been going for 50 years. And that's why they're in Bristol, actually. It's that Golden Jubilee. So we want to celebrate that. And this is the next generation of Tearfund pioneers. Jack, he's only 42. He's been all over the world twice. But it's great to have you here today.
Thanks. I've got this one, so I'm all good.
I'll take it all back.
Thank you. Yeah, it is really exciting to be with you. Tearfund, as just been said, turned 50. And it's an amazing testament, really, to the grace of God and to the generosity of his people. I don't know if you know, but Tearfund started because the church saw a crisis and didn't know how to respond, started sending money to the Evangelical Alliance, and then they said, well, what do we do with this? And on the back of that, they launched Tearfund, which originally was the Evangelical Alliance Relief Fund, and then has grown into its whole own thing. And so really being here and sharing in Tearfund's 50th birthday with you is a real privilege, and yeah, we want to say thank you for all of those that have supported us, that have prayed for the church around the world as they tackle poverty and bring hope to the hopeless. And it's a joy to be with you this morning as well. I grew up in Devon and went to college in Taunton, so whenever I'm coming back to the southwest from London, it's so nice to see the hills start to appear, and it's like, oh, I'm almost home. So it's really nice to be with you this weekend. This morning, I want to help us think a little bit, as part of your series on City of Hope, about what it looks like to be really rooted in hope. When we think about the injustices that we see in Bristol or around the world, it can be hard to lose hope if we're not rooted in the right places. Last week, you heard about the growth of homelessness in Bristol and the number of people affected by that, or children relying on food parcels, and those kind of things can be overwhelming. And working out how to respond can be complicated. Or for me, in my work at Tearfund, most weeks I hear stories of how people are impacted by climate change and how it's pushing people back into poverty. I heard about a guy named Dakar who lives in Somaliland with his wife and children the other week. And he's a watermelon farmer and used to be able to predict when the rains would come. And he was saying to our partners in Somaliland that the rains just don't come at the right times. Droughts are more severe and more common, and he can't predict the rain anymore. And that's affecting his ability to grow watermelons to provide for his family. And so I'm hearing stories like that. And if we're not grounded in the right place, those issues and these injustices that we want to bring hope to can overwhelm us. If our eyes aren't fixed on Jesus, who's the hope for everything, then we can be overwhelmed by the situations we're trying to bring hope to. So this morning, I want to help us think about what's it look like to be rooted in the hope of Jesus. Now, maybe that's a little bit of a heavy start, thinking about all the injustices and everything that overwhelms us. So I want to take a little step backwards now and ask who likes going to the cinema. I absolutely love it. Give me a wave if you're a film fan. If it's the cinema or Netflix binging, great, quite a few of us. I'm in good company. For me, what makes a good film is when I really get to know the characters, when I can feel the emotions of the lead characters, when I cry with them, I laugh with them, and I cheer them on when they're winning. For me, that makes a great film. And I get utterly engrossed for the 2 hours or however long the film is. And I saw The Greatest Showman a little while ago. Give me a wave if you've seen The Greatest Showman. Okay, a few of us. For those that haven't, it's a new musical set in 1800s New York. And it starts with a little boy who grows up in poverty, stealing bread. And then he begins to fulfill his dreams and opens a circus, the first one in the US. And if you ignore the shady, real, true story behind it, it is a brilliant, fun film. And I absolutely loved watching it. And there's a point towards the end of the film, I'll try not to ruin it for those who are going to watch it later on today, but there's a point towards the end where the hero does something heroic and you don't know if it's gone wrong. And the camera just lingers a little bit too long. So I'm there in the cinema with my friends on the row, and I'm sat there just wondering what's going to happen. He's gone, the music has stopped, and the camera just lingers. I start biting off all my nails with nerves, looking down, thinking, what on earth is going to happen? I'm behind this guy, I'm cheering him on, but now he's gone. And then all of a sudden, you start to see his outline emerge from the smoke, and the music starts to build. And I look down my row and go, yes, he's alive, it's all good, we're going to have a great day. And I was just so relieved to know he was okay. And maybe you've had a similar experience with the film, maybe not quite as extreme as that. But that feeling of nervousness and not really sure what's going to happen next, and then that relief and that excitement when we see that the hero is okay. And I want you to hold on to those two feelings for this morning. I'm going to read you a chunk of John. No prizes for guessing where we find our hope. I'm going to read you the account of Jesus' resurrection in John. So we're in John 20. I'm just going to read it to you now. So John 20. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Then I'll jump ahead to verse 10. The disciples looked around, and then they went back to where they were staying, having not found Jesus. Now Mary stood outside the tomb, crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? What is it? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Now that gets me every time. Isn't it an incredible story? As we were singing earlier, that line, his buried body began to breathe. The miraculousness of Jesus' resurrection is amazing. And in John's account that we just read, I'm amazed at the journey Mary must have been on during that day. She started the day coming to the grave to say her goodbye to her hero, not really knowing what had gone on, wondering what was going to happen next. And then she stood there weeping outside the tomb. Everyone else had left and given up. And then she turns around, seeing the person she thought was the gardener, and says, "I don't know what they've done with him." And all Jesus has to do is say her name. He says, "Mary." And suddenly, her eyes widen. She wipes the tears away with the back of her arm. She runs at him because her hero is back. He has conquered death and risen again and is back in the garden with her. And so as she says her name, her eyes widen, she runs at him. She's reunited with her hero again. And if it was a film, I think the camera would start to pan out as she's running towards him. The music would reach a crescendo, and I'd look down my row and be like, "He's back, he's done it, this is amazing." It's such an incredible story. And I love the interaction with Mary because it's a glimpse into what Jesus does with each of us, isn't it? As Jesus stands there and meets Mary in her hopelessness, all Jesus does is say her name, and suddenly she realizes who she's in the company of. And her hope is lifted. She's reunited with him. And for each of us, God does that. He calls us by name and comes and finds us where we are and reunites us with him. It's an amazing, amazing gift. But I think John is saying there's something even bigger going on, even bigger than the salvation of Mary and all of us going on in this story. And he's been hinting at it all the way through the passages. So if we have the first slide up, in John 20, verse 1, we see that it says, "Early in the morning on the first day of the week, while it was still dark." Now, this sounds familiar to me. I'm not sure about you. And then a little bit later on, it says, thinking he was the gardener, she said, now, is anyone feeling like this is a little bit familiar? Because in verse 1, John says, "Early in the morning on the first day of the week, while it was still dark." To me, that sounds a lot like the beginning of Genesis, when we're back on day 1 of the week, when there is no light, where it is dark, and it is the beginning of the week again. If we have the next slide. And then a bit later on in the passage, where Mary thinks she sees the gardener, John is kind of teasing us, because of course she does see the gardener. She sees the gardener of Genesis 3 who walks in the cool of the evening breeze with the people he's created. And then a bit later on in the passage, further than I read, Jesus comes and meets the disciples in the upper room, in their locked room, and he comes and meets them. And as he's with them, he breathes the Holy Spirit into them. He breathes new life into his people. And for me, that feels a lot like Genesis 2, when God takes the form of Adam and breathes life into him for the first time. And so through this account in John of Jesus' resurrection, I think we see that God comes and finds each of us in our situations, calls us by name and reunites us with him. But he also does so much more. He says to all things and all creation, this is day one of the week again. We are back at the beginning again. Everything that sin has broken and damaged, all the hurt and pain, the mistakes and the violence and everything else that we see in this world, we're back at the beginning again. I am restoring everything that sin has broken. And we see in Jesus that he is beginning something new in this moment. And then when Paul writes, he invites us to participate in Jesus' ministry of reconciliation, reuniting everything and all creation and all people with their Creator and Savior. So in John, we discover there is this amazing hope, not just for all of us and all the people that we meet, but for all creation as well. That God is restoring what is broken. Because in Jesus, we don't find a God who gives us a ticket to an evacuation to a heaven on a cloud somewhere. But we see a God who invades with his kingdom into this world and restores and reunites us with him and sets a new way of living in this world, a way where there is no more tears or pain or suffering, and we will see that in its fullness when Jesus comes back again. So that is where we can ground our hope, this amazing hope that Jesus has already done it on the cross. He's already gone through our biggest fear, our biggest enemy, and risen out of the other side. Jesus has done it. And so regardless of the brokenness and the injustices that we see around us, we can have hope because we are rooted in the resurrection of Jesus. We are resurrection people, and we carry that with us as we go out to face injustices. And this is an amazing hope, but I want us to think quickly now about what it looks like for us to carry that hope and to participate in that hope in our everyday situations. Paul writes in Romans, a passage that I think really helps us to understand that. In Romans verse 2 that's on the screen now, it says, "Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Now, I think because we've met this amazing Savior, because he's called us by name, we're reunited with him, and because we share in that vision of everything being restored and all darkness driven out by light, we cannot conform to the patterns of this broken world. There's no way we can live that way anymore. I was thinking, what might those patterns look like if Paul was writing it today? And I think it would be things like patterns of disbelief, that a terminal diagnosis means there's no chance of healing. Or a pattern of entitlement that says, I deserve cheap clothes, even if someone made in the image of God on the other side of the world is forced into slavery to make it. Or perhaps the pattern of overconsumption that results in loads of plastic in the oceans when God has declared all creation very good. These kinds of patterns of a broken world are things we simply cannot conform to because we know the Savior and the Restorer and the Redeemer of all things. And so I want to invite you to invite God into your hearts to work through that transformation process, to continue what he's already doing in your hearts. Because as we saw in that verse, the transformation begins in our hearts but seeps out into everything that we are, the way that we are in Bristol and in the world, the way we buy things and consume, the way that we talk to people, the way that we stop on the street to talk to people who others are neglecting. And in the verse before that one, in Romans 12:1, it says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God." I think this is a really helpful verse to think about what that transformation looks like. Because do not conform is an instruction. It's an invitation into what God is doing in us, but it's also an instruction to work it out in our lives. As God transforms our hearts, as we are aligned with him more and more, we are then called to worship him with everything that we've got, to not conform to the brokenness, but to model a better way, to worship him with everything we've got. And when it comes to global issues like plastic pollution, for me, this has been a real journey over the last few years. Started with a keep cup, and I've seen you guys have got some in the foyer for sale. But my journey started with a keep cup and saying, actually, God, you said creation is good, so I'm going to use this. I'm going to thank you for the oceans, for the fish, for everything that you've created as I have my coffee. And then from there, God has continued working in me. And now I have a little jar in my kitchen at home. I should have brought it with me. It's about this big, and it has all my rubbish in for the year. Because God's been working in me. He says, don't conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed. And so as I consume and as I find other ways of working, God invites me to participate in a different way, a better way. And perhaps he's talking to you about different ways that he's calling you to respond as well. Those people in the office that others ignore or don't appreciate, saying, no, model a better way. Or those that others walk past in the street and pretend they don't matter, stopping, learning their names, and finding out how their day is. Things like that resist the patterns of this world and model a better way forward, a way that is built on Jesus' hope and resurrection that we all carry within us. So I want to invite you to do that today. But before going practically into what that might mean, I want to share with you a couple of stories of how this is happening around the world. So in Nigeria, we are working with a group of young people in Yola, in a district in the north of Nigeria. And these young people have been studying through a Bible study called Live Justly, learning what it looks like to be God's kingdom builders in Yola. And as a result, after their Bible studies, they went and saved up together and bought some trees. And they started planting them down the main high street in Yola, outside all of the banks there. And then they asked the banks to look after the trees, to keep watering them. And then it spiraled from there. They've now spoken to the government about getting more investment for greening and cleaning Yola. And they've started a whole movement because they've been inspired by this restoration story that Jesus invites us to participate in. Or in Tanzania, where this guy is from in the picture, they started a health clinic amongst a bunch of rural villages in Tanzania because they wanted to practically show the love of God to the people that they were living amongst. And so they built this health clinic and started treating people, and then they realized that loads of people were coming with burns on their arms or their faces or in different places. And they began to ask the question, why? And so we helped them look into what was going on, and we found out that the burns were coming from the fact people were using kerosene lamps, so lamps with a naked flame to light their homes at night because they didn't have electricity. And so children and parents were coming in with burns because of that. And so the churches came together, and although they didn't have much themselves, started saving together. And they've managed to buy over 200 solar panels for these rural communities. Because they said, actually, being hope and healing the brokenness of this place doesn't stop with just treating burns. But it says we're going to get to the root of the problem, and we're going to show a different way forward, a better way that cares for creation, looks after the poor, and provides people with the opportunity to get out of poverty. And so they've made a huge difference in that community. And when we heard about those kind of stories, we wanted to support them. So we've been investing in more projects like that ourselves. But we've also been calling on the government to invest in more projects like that. And last week we heard from the government that they will invest millions more into projects that help people in rural poverty to have access to electricity. And so I want to invite you this morning to join us in that. We're calling on the World Bank, and you've got cards under your chairs, to invest more in off-grid renewables. So projects that help people who are living in rural places in poverty without electricity to gain access, to have access to a local solar panel. And that kind of change is a small part of what it looks like, I think, to be people who participate in this restoration story, to participate in this bringing hope to brokenness and healing to where there is darkness. And so I want to invite you to do that. You might have a big version like this, or you might have a small version like this. But either way, this card is in here. And I'd love to invite you in a moment to think about whether you could sign this and join with us. The Christians I was talking about in Nigeria have managed to get the Vice President of Nigeria to sign it as well. So you're joining with Christians around the world who are speaking up and saying this matters because we know a better world is possible. So I want to invite you to do that. But I also want to invite you to think about what it looks like to worship with our whole lives. What simple changes can we make in our own lives that become acts of worship? We've been giving this morning to Mission at the front but what everyday decisions can be part of that as well. So for me, it was my keep cup and then my rubbish. For you, it might be a one-off change that you follow the lead of the church and you switch your home to renewable energy. And then as you turn your lights on, you pray for the people in Tanzania and you thank God for the sun and the wind that powers your home. And all of it helps to realign us with the God of all creation and the God who is restoring and redeeming all things that sin has broken. So I'm going to stop talking in a second and just let you invite God to speak to you now. Maybe you've never felt like God has called you by name, as he did with Mary in the garden. And if you're here wondering what on earth that would feel like, I want to invite you to do that this morning, to invite God to speak to you and call you by name, to reunite yourself with the Creator who loves you dearly. And if you are someone who knows him really well, then I want to invite you to ask him, what's it look like for me to continue to be transformed, to align myself with what you are doing in this world, to be someone who lives a better way, who models a better way to the world around us. And I want to invite you to think about whether you could sign this card and join with Christians around the world who are speaking up for others to do the same. So I'm going to stop talking now and let you engage with God. Jesus, I want to thank you for what you did for each of us on the cross. Thank you that we can have hope despite whatever situation we're living through or situations we're engaging with through groups like People and Planet or other initiatives. Jesus, thank you that you have done it, that you are the restorer and redeemer. And we ask that you would use us to be kingdom builders in Bristol and around the world. That we would be people who carry that hope to those without any. And God, would you humble me and each of us? Would you expose to us ways that we are conforming to the brokenness of this world? And would you stir in us a new way of living, a way that aligns us more with your heart for your people and your world? If you guys do want to join in with the Christians in Tanzania and in Nigeria and speaking up with those cards, then I'm going to be by the door on the way out collecting those in. And there are pens on most of the rows and cards around you.
Thank you so much, Jack, for sharing with us. And there's, I guess, the message of today's service is, as human beings, we're not just spirits or souls or bodies, but we're all of those things, and all of those things have needs, and God's involved in all of them. He's a God of justice and mercy.